So again, good morning everyone. So any questions, queries, clarifications from the previous classes? So we'll begin with that and then we'll move on to this today. No? It is sometimes scary for a teacher if there are no questions actually, because there can be two possibilities, that either the thing is too opaque for asking questions or things are too easy so that there are no questions. Anyway, so again, if you have any questions at any point of time, please do ask. So what we're going to do today is an important aspect of English language education, and again has a long history, so we'll go back to that history to understand what is happening with this aspect of English language education. Now, as you remember, in the first and the second class, we talked about the English being taught mostly in colonial situations, and because in the colonial situation you did not have ready-made books which could be used in the class, because again, if you remember, I said that English as a formal subject was not even taught in the mother country, in UK. So when English is introduced in colonies, what do teachers take to the classroom? Okay, so what kind of books do we teach? So one way out, especially for higher education, for example in colleges and universities, was that you have a pool of English literature which could be taken into the classroom. The assumption was that if you study literature, you will automatically learn the language. Okay? In fact, the logic that was given was that since literature contains the best of language, therefore, if you expose students to the best of English language, then students will automatically pick up language. Now, let me tell you right at the beginning that this theory now has been discarded, because people have realized that you need special kind of material for different groups of learners. For initial beginners learners, you can't bring literature because it's too difficult for them. Even till for the school level, literature can be extremely challenging, because literature, remember, is specialized language. It is not really language that is meant for language teaching. And from your own experience of learning your own languages, home languages, I am sure that you understand that you don't start learning the language by learning literary texts. Okay? What you do is you talk with people, you pick up language from the streets, etc., and that's how you learn a language. But this was the assumption. When this assumption started getting questioned, primarily because people realized that when people are simply studying literature, they are not picking up language as they were supposed to, then what happens is people start questioning this method of just using literature for teaching of language. Okay? And therefore, they needed textbooks. Okay? Now, you have to prepare a textbook. And I am sure your own experience of learning English in your school days has been through textbooks. So there would be these textbooks that would be given to you depending on which country you belong to, but every country has a kind of a national curriculum, and the textbooks generally follow that national curriculum, and accordingly textbooks are prepared. So this entire process of preparing textbooks was called material production. Okay? So this entire idea of material production primarily was meant for textbooks, but as we will see, the idea has expanded now because people have also realized that it is not only through the textbook that people learn languages. People also learn languages from interactions with other kinds of languages outside the classroom. Okay. So of course, you needed a principle for producing material. So if you are producing material, for example, all of you are textbook writers, and if I ask you to prepare a textbook for the primary school outside the campus, you need to have certain kind of guidelines of how to prepare a textbook. Okay. So there's principles of material production came into existence, and people started, and there was a long debate about what is the best way to produce a textbook, how do you produce material for the classroom, etc., etc. So, we will just look at a few of them and then we will go back in history to understand. Let me ask you a question before we come to that part of the story. How many of you learnt English at your secondary or higher levels? Can we have a raise of hands? Did you have English as a subject with the help of textbooks? How many of you learnt English at the secondary and the higher secondary level? All of you? Okay. How many of these textbooks had other languages than English? Okay. So, as a part of the curriculum, right? But as a part of the English textbook, did you have any other language in the English textbook? No? So, there would be translations. Any other experience? In India, it's impossible. No English. So, all English textbooks were prepared only with English. That's the assumption, right? So, we will see that this is not how material production began, okay? But we will go back to history to understand, and this is something that we are again coming back to. So, we will talk about these debates about should other languages also come into the classroom when we are teaching English, okay? Or should they not be allowed at all, or should it be something that should be taught separately and not as a part of English subject, etc., etc. So, all these debates are still again alive after almost 150 years. So, what is material production? Material production primarily is the use of material, very simple definition, for pedagogic purposes. Okay. So, if you want to teach anything, you need material, and anything that is produced as that material has a teaching purpose. Okay. So, if you are using it for a pedagogic purpose, that is a material. Okay. Material can be of different types. So, it could be, for example, literary text. So, you can have literature. So, I am sure that your own experience of studying English through textbooks, you will have poems and you will have short stories, you will have essays, you will have biographies, etc., etc. So, these are also kind of literary pieces. But you can also have material which is called realia. Okay? For example, I can use an advertisement from a newspaper as material. I can use a chocolate wrapper as material because it will have some English hopefully in it. I might have a cooking recipe as material. Okay? So, these are called realia materials. We will not go deep into what materials are. And there was this debate in the 1980s, and that is where we will begin, about should we use what were known as authentic texts in the class. Okay. So, what were authentic texts, and we will come to that, they are on the slides, but just as a kind of a preview, authentic texts are those texts that were originally produced not for teaching, okay, but can be repurposed for the purpose of teaching. So, you repurpose texts that were not meant for teaching. For example, a cooking recipe was not meant for teaching, it was meant for cooking. Okay. But what you do is you repurpose the cooking recipe to teach language. So, these were called authentic texts because they were called authentic because they were texts that were not originally created only for teaching. They were there in the authentic world outside. Okay. What do material need? The first criteria of any material is that it should have impact. Okay. What do we mean by impact? That the material should be able to achieve what it is meant to do. For example, if my material says that this material is going to help students to write, or this material is going to help students to listen to something or to speak, or etc., it should be able to achieve that outcome. Okay? So, every material has a goal, what is known as learning outcomes. Okay. So, at the end of my teaching, these are the things that the students should be able to do. If my material achieves those goals, then it has an impact. If my material does not achieve those goals, then I'll have to revise the material, because obviously there is some failure between my material and the outcome that it was supposed to have. Okay. Now, in order to create impact, therefore, there were lots of things that were discussed. I have listed a few of them. One of them was, of course, novelty. So, the material has to be novel, it has to be new. Okay. Now, novelty does not always mean that it has to be something revolutionary. Okay. It can also mean that we know that languages change over a period of time, and material should be able to address those changes in languages when they are brought into the classroom. So, for example, if my entire material consists of Shakespeare, then it does not have novelty, primarily because I am teaching only a part of language which is hardly used anywhere, either in spoken or written form. Okay. So, I will have to be novel in that sense. So, I should use as much of current language as possible in teaching the language. The second, of course, is variety. Now, imagine if your textbooks were only poems, or only short stories, or only essays, or only biographies, then obviously it will be extremely boring. So, you have a large amount of variety in your material, as much as possible. Yeah? One of the things that we forget is that these textbooks that you had in your classroom, again a question to you, and all of you can respond. So, how did they look like? I mean, in terms of the book, actual book? Very, very boring. Okay. Okay. Very thick. Okay. Were these NCERT textbooks? English? Oxford textbook, which is surprising because they generally make it pretty attractive. Other colorful books, okay. Oh yes, yes, of course. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. This is an interesting debate. So, when I say attractive presentation, so with print, remember print as a medium comes into existence in a big way only around the end of the 18th century and 19th century. Okay, so the spread of print happens at that point of time. Okay. Initially, there were not much options available to the publishers. Okay. So, they would use a limited amount of fonts, limited amount of jacket designs, etc., etc. With the expansion of print, what happened was you had more options. You could use more colors, for example. Originally, you could use only 4 colors, okay, in a printed textbook. Now, of course, you can use as many colors as you want, etc. But there is a catch over there, and this again is a question to all of you. Again, from the countries that you come from, is the textbook produced by private organizations, or is it kind of sometimes also produced by the government? Always by the government. Bangladesh in the government, Indonesia by the government, private and government. You were saying by the government, which is again, so that there's the catch. Now, if it is government produced, remember, these textbooks will have to reach quite a large number of the population, yeah? And they have to be cheap and sometimes free. Now, well, in India for a very long time, for example, they were free, but now you have to pay a very nominal amount, but you still have to pay an amount right now. Okay, so you have to pay this fees at the beginning, which also contains the textbook fees. Yeah. Now, if you are producing these kind of books which are to be given out free or at a very low price, you can't have a very attractive glossy paper, a lot of colors in the textbook, etc. So, I think one of the reactions that came as soon as I asked how did they look like was they looked very boring. Okay. They need to look boring primarily because they need to cut down on costs, okay, because they can't really produce huge amounts of textbooks which are very expensive in nature. Okay. So there's the catch. So when I say attractive presentation, I think we'll need to keep in mind, I would request you to, they are available online, go and see Sri Lankan textbooks. We had a friend from Sri Lanka, he's not here. Especially after 2010, they have been excellent, they're really, really good. Primarily because what they have done now is they get what is known as extramural funding from other corporate offices, etc., which helps them to improve on the quality of the textbook. So they are really good with lots of pictures, etc. But depends again from country to country. So attractive presentation might be defined in different ways in different countries, etc. More importantly, it should have appealing content. Okay? So you might not have very glossy pictures, you might not have very attractive colors all of the textbook, but you should have appealing content in the textbook itself. And this brings us to authentic text. So one of the principles of material production, especially after the 1980s, is that it should contain authentic language. Okay? Language that is not something that is absolutely dated, language that is currently in use. In fact, the term that is used for these kind of languages is called language in use. You mentioned the BBC one. So Cambridge has this entire series called language in use series, okay, which uses actual, it is very cold here. So it uses this form of language which is currently in use, language that is contemporary, etc. Okay. Now remember, the impact is always going to be variable, and that is why you have revision of textbooks, and I am sure that across every country you will see that you will have a new education policy which will then go back and look at the textbooks, they will revise the textbooks, etc., depending on the impact that the textbooks have. Okay? So these are the basic things of material production that needs to be kept in mind. We will come to the last part, which is the authentic text, and what do we mean by it. So what is an authentic text, and there are different definitions of it, so I will just give you some of them. So there are people, some scholars like David Little, they believe that authentic texts are designed primarily for an L1 audience, and I am sure that you know this distinction between L1 and L2. So L1 is when you use English as the first language, so English as your home language. L2 is when you English as a second language, and you also can have English as a foreign language. Okay? So you have an EFL form. Okay? And as you can see, in 1988, Little said that authentic texts might not work with people who use English as a second language. Okay? They are good for English as a first language speakers, but they are not good with English with a second language speakers. Okay? But the view changed over a period of time, and I wanted you to show this distinction. Earlier than that, authentic texts were primarily seen as texts that could provide communicative function. Okay? So which helps you to communicate. So the focus here is on speaking more. Okay? So any text that helps you in your communicative ability is an authentic text. Okay? So that is what the understanding was. By 1992, people like Rebecca Oxford started saying that authentic texts are those texts that are taken as they are from authentic situations. For example, let me come back to the cooking recipe example. If I am taking a cooking recipe example or text, then I will have to put it in the textbook in an unedited, unabridged form. So I don't change it. I don't make any changes to the text at all. I just put it in the textbook, or I bring it to the class and use that text for teaching in the class. Yeah? Any problems with this? Can you foresee any problem? If I use these kind of texts, texts that are used in an advertisement or a newspaper article or whatever, and I bring it to the class. The problem lies in when you are learning English as a second language. Remember, when a newspaper article is getting written, they are not writing it for being used in a classroom. And therefore, sometimes these texts can be extremely difficult for second language users to process. Okay? And this again became a big debate, but I thought I'll just keep that on the slide. And Noonan in 1998 said, this is David Noonan, who said that it is any kind of a material which is not specifically meant for teaching. Okay? So, the original purpose of the material is something else, but what you do is you use it for teaching and you bring it to the class and you use it for teaching. So, that is what an authentic text was. And people like Michael Day would say that this is not something new. In fact, by 2000 they said that, I mean, I don't know why this debate about authentic text is happening, because it actually started happening even during the communicative language teaching movement of the 1970s. So, the communicative language teaching movement, which we talked about in our previous class, used quite a lot of authentic texts. So, I don't know why this debate is now happening, whether authentic text should be used, should not be used, etc. Okay, so, there is another version of this. Now, few words of warning on authentic text, which one we have already. Now, if you are a teacher walking into a classroom, then you are best aware of what your students are capable of doing and what your students are not capable of doing. Okay? And therefore, even before thinking about what sort of a text to bring to the classroom, which most of the time, remember, most teachers do not have an option for, because the teacher is given a textbook and the teacher is supposed to complete the textbook and there will be an exam on the textbook. Okay? But if you are using a textbook, even then it is important to know the students and the potential level of their understanding, what is known as language proficiency. Okay? So, if you are not aware of the language proficiency of your students, then it would be a disaster if you bring in a text which does not connect with the students at all. Okay? So, if you are using a textbook, I think one of the problems that we face in national level curriculum is that it does not take into consideration different sorts of areas and different sorts of students and different sorts of exposure to different sorts of languages. Okay? So, we kind of decide that this textbook is going to be used in standard 5, this is going to be used in standard 10 or whatever. But when you take it to the classroom, depending on the context that you are in, obviously the text does not make any sense at all. Okay? Again, a personal anecdote, we had a student used to teach in a part of Gujarat which was pretty semi-urban area, but we had students from extremely rural areas who used to come in. And this was an MA program, mind you. I am not even talking about school level children. So, we had students who would not be able to read a sentence at MA level. They have passed all their BA degrees and everything, yeah? And they have come to MA and they would not be able to read sentences and make sense of them. Okay? So, assuming that they are going to do a high degree MA course, something has gone wrong in the system. So, they have passed, we do not know how, and they have been able to negotiate the system in such a way they have reached a place where, well, they are going to do an MA degree. Okay? So, again, this is the problem. You carry a textbook in a classroom and then of course, the textbook does not connect with the students at all. So, this is one important thing that needs to be remembered, because what this was a what is known as a longitudinal study. They studied textbooks across 4 countries, mostly in Southeast Asia, and they said that one of the problems of many textbooks is that unmodified texts or A text without sufficient scaffolding can be extremely frustrating to students who are not ready for the text. Okay. So, if you do not have enough support for the text, because I remember some of you had experience of teaching, and as teachers you are given a textbook, yeah, and you are supposed to complete it. The textbook does not tell you how to support students in getting their languages done. You have to complete a lesson and that is it. So, if there is not enough support available, if there is no scaffolding available, then it becomes a problem for the text to be used in the classroom. Okay? You cannot really force students and say that you have to learn it or memorize it, and that is what happens in many of the classrooms. Students memorize an answer and simply write it in the exam. Just to give you an example of this, I will write something on the board, and I am sure that all of you will be able to answer the questions. Okay. Let us first start reading it. If someone can volunteer to read it aloud.
There was brilliant and the
Slidhy or slidey?
slidey to this addition.
No, I am asking, I do not know.
Okay.
Because there is no word in English called slidhy. 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 Yeah.
There was brilliant and the slidhy to sit, gimble and gamble in the way all flimsy were the borrowers and wrapped came the outrage.
I am sure all of you understood it. What it means. No? No? Okay. Let me ask you questions. Okay. And I am sure all of you can answer them without understanding a word that what it says. What was brilling and slidey? What was brilling and slidey?
They were first.
No, I am asking you a question, you have to answer, okay, based on the poem that you have not understood. What did the wave do? Gimble and gamble, okay.
But wave is in the, so wave is a place.
Hopefully, but you can still answer the question, right? Okay. What was Mimsy?
A group of people.
No, according to the poem. Borrowers, okay. Who came out at the end of the poem? Rats, okay. How could you answer these questions without understanding a word what it was saying? This is a very famous poem from Alice in Wonderland. Okay. This is a poem called Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll. Obviously, you can see it's a nonsense poem. Okay. It doesn't make any sense at all. And that was the idea of the poem itself. But you can still answer the questions how. So, what you recognize is the grammatical structure. Without understanding a word of the poem, you can still answer it. So, one of the issues of many of the examination systems was that you could memorize without understanding and then answer the questions. So, you did not need to understand anything at all, because the questions were as such that you could still kind of guess what the meaning would be, okay, etc. And this is something that this study showed, that you need some sort of a scaffolding, some sort of a support system. Okay? Otherwise, it's going to become like this. You ask questions which are obvious questions, and people can answer that because you understand the underlying grammatical structure, you know what the subject is, the object is, and then you kind of say, okay, this is the answer, etc. Yeah? The second thing that was again a part of this study is that it's impossible to teach students everything. I think it is something that we need to keep in mind. Okay? So, a textbook can never be fully understood, it's impossible. Okay? So, we will have to choose the kind of battles that we choose when we are preparing textbooks. We will have to keep in mind that there will be students who are less proficient and there will be students who are more proficient. And this level needs to be kept in mind. So, you will have simpler things and you will have more complex things. Okay? And that therefore requires very focused instruction. Okay? What are the students supposed to do with the textbook? What tends to happen in classrooms is, and I am sure that you can share your own experiences of learning English, is that the teacher comes to the classroom, says that we are going to study this poem, explains the poem sometimes, and then straightforward goes on to the questions and answers section, fill in the blanks, matching activities, etc. The lesson is completed, and then the teacher says, this is your homework, you go back and do some homework, which mostly your parents help you to do. When you come back to the class, you submit that homework, and then you say, okay, these are the questions that are going to be asked. Okay? So, there is no application of the text to actual usage of the language. Okay? So, that is one issue that we need to be careful about. So, instructions have to be focused. What are they supposed to learn and how are they supposed to learn it? And that is how a textbook needs to be used. Okay? So, let us come to an old friend of ours, which we have discussed, but again something that we need to revisit is this idea of communicative competence. So, when we use a textbook, we do not simply use it for completing a lesson. Okay? So, in world literatures, what are you reading? What are the texts? I mean, some texts, not all, of course. What are some of the books that you are reading in world literatures? Death in Venice, okay. Yeah, some more. Okay. So, when we are reading a text in a classroom, remember these are also texts, right? They function as textbooks. So, let us take it at a higher level, then we will come back to this again. So, when we are reading a text in a classroom, we are of course not reading it at an MA level for learning the language. It is assumed that you know the language. Okay? So, we are not, so what is the purpose of reading that text? Understanding, okay, one. Thinking critically. What does it mean when people tell me that thinking critically? What really does it mean?
How to approach the text with question.
Okay. So, it is not simply reading the text and then saying this is what the text means. That is the first level, right? So, you do not simply read a text and summarize and that is the end of it. Yeah? So, you have to go beyond that. You have to go and see and critique the text, maybe even question the text, etc., etc. That is what leads to critical thinking. So, in critical thinking, there are something called the cognitive strategies. People who were there in Professor Badua's lecture yesterday, Professor Bijay Badua had a lecture on the analytic of the sublime yesterday. So, people who are there would know that this is an old idea. So, it is not simply that you stop at comprehension, but it leads to analytic, you analyze. So there are these cognitive strategies, things that help you understand, but there are also these metacognitive strategies. So strategies that help you not only to understand a thing, but also to reflect upon it, to critique it, to synthesize different ideas. That is what you are doing in MA in World Literature. It's not simply comprehension, because that's taken for granted. What you are supposed to do is reflection, synthesize, create even. So based on a text, you might go on to create a painting, or you might go on to create whatever, a project, an installation, we don't know. Okay? So even those are metacognitive strategies that you employ. Now, if these instructions are clear right at the beginning of the course, then you know what to achieve. Okay? But I know in a semester system, you also have the pressure of the exams, right, and the assignments. So what tends to happen is those higher levels of cognition are difficult to achieve because, primarily because, you just do not have the time, the pressure of time. The same thing happens in the school levels. So you have a textbook, you have a pressure of time, you have to complete it. In that case, what also tends to happen is that this suffers. Okay? So any kind of, you can call it critical competence at your level, but communicative competence at a lower level, this starts suffering. Okay? Because first of all, the purpose is not very clear. Second of all, the focus is on the end product, the examination. Okay? And because the focus is so much on the examination, this starts suffering over a period of time. Okay? So I'm sure that you have met teachers umpteen number of times who would say, I don't know, when people have been studying English for 10 years, 12 years, but still they don't know anything about it, okay, etc. So I'm sure that you have frustrations coming across all along. And one of the reasons is primarily because the communicative competence starts suffering moment you move away from clear instructions, purposes, etc. Okay, so if I make it clear what the purpose of a text is, why am I doing it? Okay, that's why I asked you the question. Someone might have got 70% in their BA or 80%. What does it mean? It doesn't tell you anything. It simply means that you have been able to write answers and someone has evaluated them, and it doesn't tell you what it really means, what you can do. Okay? And that is one of the issues that needs to be addressed constantly when we are dealing with textbooks. Okay. So let's come to this idea of communicative competence, our old friend again. So the idea, remember, was not simply how to say things, but when to say what. Okay. This was the core idea of communicative competence. So it's not simply that you are accurate, but you are also appropriate. Okay. So you should be able to use language not as a correct, accurate form, but remember that is what gets tested in grammar or in any kind of a question. So if you remember, if you can go back in time and think of your homework that was given to the teacher, you would have these red circles, this is wrong. So it was mostly error correction rather than why is that error happening? What is the feedback on that error? How do you go and correct that error? That never came because, I mean, you can't blame the teachers because they have to check 60 papers, give feedback on them. It's not possible for them to meet individually every one of them and give feedback. Yeah. So it is important to know when to say what, and we know that Himes introduced this idea. And what he said was linguistic knowledge is not the whole picture. Okay? So you might have knowledge of a language, but that doesn't mean you know how to use it. Okay? That is not the whole picture, because you use language as a social phenomenon, and therefore along with the linguistic knowledge, you need to have the social knowledge as well. Okay? And this is something that textbooks have started paying attention to in recent times. So along with linguistic knowledge, I'll give you some examples of how textbooks have addressed this. And these are some examples given in the Savile Troike book. I'll give you a reference list at the end of the course, or I'll mail it to you so that you can go back to books and have a look. And this is Xavier Troche. She gives very specific examples of how to introduce communicative competence by using textbooks. Okay. So I'll give you some of them. She says, for example, there is this in every language, there is this knowledge or expectation of who or who may not speak in certain settings. Okay? I'll give you an example of this. When you visit a doctor, how much time do you speak and how much time does the doctor speak, generally speaking? Depends on the doctor. So there are three phases in a doctor-patient conversation. Okay? The first phase is where the patient speaks, the doctor listens. The second phase is what is known as the phase of examination. So the doctor would say, please, whatever, I'll take a pressure or whatever, something happens. And the third phase is the phase of diagnosis, where the doctor tells you, probably medicates you, and explains to you what you're going to do, and also probably sets up a future conversation. So come back after 7 days, we'll have a look again. That's the structure of a doctor-patient conversation. Now imagine a patient who walks into a doctor's chamber and refuses to stop talking. The second and the third phase cannot happen. Okay? So these kind of social expectations are part of every cultural situation. Okay? And this is something that Xavier Troche says is a part of the communicative competence as well. I gave you a very mundane example, but you can think of other examples as well. Let me ask you a more recent example. So when you call someone on your phone, okay? Imagine that you are making a call on your mobile phone. What is the first word that you use? Why? The phone shows who is calling. The other person knows who is calling. Why hello? To? Have you ever thought about it?
Yeah, that's a behavioral pattern that exists. Like namaskar.
Okay.
But
So-
it is about we are audible to each other also.
Okay.
Because several times we say hello, 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 several times.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
it asks for attention. If I say hello, then
That is the reason. So what the hello does, it of course operates as a form of greeting, but it also operates as something which is known as creating a feedback loop. So what tends to happen is if you say hello and you don't get the hello back, then you keep saying hello, can you hear me, etc., etc., etc. Because you expect that feedback loop that someone is listening to you. Okay? Now this is another communicative situation which helps you to understand different aspects of communicative competence, etc. So this is what she is basically mentioning. The second one she says is this is another part of all cultural situations. People speak differently depending on the status and the roles that they play within a certain socio-cultural, and this may change over a period of time, but this is exactly what happens. Okay? I'll give you an example. It's Xavier Troche who actually gives this example, and this is in the UK. So this is a real incident. So remember that, and Sir will also say this, that in most of the European countries, the relationship between the student and the teacher is pretty friendly. Okay? So act more as friends. So there is this conversation between this student who is moving into a hostel. Okay? She has recently joined the course, and this was actually a conversation that that actually happened. And the teacher is also, so you have these mentors, so she is also the mentor of the student, and so she walks into this teacher's classroom and tells the teacher, so the teacher says, you have not been able to hand in your assignment, is something wrong? So the student says, ma'am, I'm trying to kind of set up my room, I've just moved in, it's taking a long time. So the teacher gives a friendly advice saying that, well, I think you should hurry up a bit so that you can submit the assignment as soon as you can. And the student responds by saying, oh, you don't say that. Okay. Now there is a reason why she says it, because the teacher's room is very cluttered in itself. Okay. So she means that you should clean up also, your room. And the immediate response of the teacher is, I think you should hand it over tomorrow, the assignment. Okay. Now what happens is, what begins as a very friendly conversation turns almost into some sort of a contest, okay, just by using one phrase. Okay. Now what has happened over there is a kind of a violation of the status and the role that is between a teacher and a student, etc. Okay. And I am sure as students you have gone through these experiences quite a lot, so I don't have to repeat this. But this is something that Saville-Troike says as an important, should be part of the material as well. So this awareness of different sorts of socio-cultural patterns in language. The third thing that she says is, we forget that language is not simply verbal behavior. There are also large amount of non-verbal behaviors that are important in language. Okay? And material should have an indication at least of non-verbal behavior. A large number of people whom I have met who have come from international countries would come and say, when Indians nod their head, we don't really know whether they are saying yes or no. Why is that? Because you have very strong, well, non-verbal features in most of the international countries, where if you say yes, it's always this. If you say no, it's always this. In India, it's much more, we are a flexible culture. So it kind of, it could be anything like this. Yeah? So you don't really know what the non-verbal gesture means. Okay. Another thing that I have heard, I'm sure sir has heard quite a lot again, is this, it is slowly kind of, I think, disappearing now, at least in urban settings. I'm not very sure about rural settings, is handshakes with women. Okay. Very common feature, for example, in many of the European countries, where the woman offers the hand when you are first meeting. There is a bit of a reluctance, especially if it's of an opposite gender, to shake the hand of a woman. Okay. That again is a very strong sociocultural pattern that needs to be looked into. Again, a non-verbal gesture, remember, which again needs to be probably incorporated in materials in a certain sense. And other features of language, for example, to ask and give information, to request, and to decline assistance or to ask for cooperation. So these are all language functions that need to be incorporated within any kind of a textbook. Okay, so that is what she points out. I think there is another one. Yeah. So how to give commands, etc. So I'll give you the reference of this book. It's quite an interesting book of what to do with material, not simply as a text, but what to do with materials which offers not simply written text, but also what these texts can achieve in a socio-cultural condition. Yeah. So let's come to a bit of history, which I promised you. All English textbooks were in English when you studied. This was not the case for a very long time, and I'm going to give you examples from India. And when I use the word India again, I'm just taking examples from Bengal, the eastern part of the country, and from Gujarat, the western part of the country. Okay? And these were textbooks that were used, let's say about 150 years back, when the British first came in. Okay? So it might give us some insights that how we have moved away from earlier models of textbooks and moved into this English only textbooks. Okay. So, some examples I will just present in front of you. Before that, some caveats. I will be focusing only on the 19th century textbooks, though there are textbooks even after that, but I am not going to go into that. I am going to talk about teaching of English, but remember in the 19th century that is extremely problematic, because the teaching of English almost coincided with the teaching of other languages. Okay, so, it is not very easy to distinguish between English language teaching or Bengali language teaching or Hindi language teaching, because they kind of coincided with each other. As I told you, the examples from Bengal and Gujarat, and I am not going to look at production. So, I am not going to talk about how these books were printed, etc., etc. We are simply going to look at the textbooks. I will give you some examples and we can have a discussion of how this happens. Now, textbooks, if you look at it historically, again in India, you can think of 6 phases of production of textbooks. So, I will just quickly go through these 6 phases and then give you examples from these 6 phases. Yeah. The first phase, of course, is when the British came to India, established more or less their, this is an important date, 1784, which I mentioned very quickly if you remember in the first talk that I gave. In 1784, the Asiatic Society was established. Yeah? And because the Asiatic Society, so we know that Asiatic Society did a lot of things, but one of the things they also did was production of textbooks. Okay? So, they also produced textbooks for education, and that is why we have taken 1784, and then I have taken the second date as 1835, because this is the date when Lord Macaulay passes his minute of education, okay, which is generally taken to be the starting point of English education in India. So, this is the first phase that we can think of, because remember English is getting taught even without Macaulay, and there were different kinds of experiments of how to teach English. So, we will look at that phase a bit. Phase 2, of course, is from 1835, this is Macaulay's minute, to 1854. In 1854, there is someone called Charles Wood who writes this dispatch, yeah? Basically complaining that we have been teaching English for 20 years and nothing has happened. Okay? People are not learning English, there is some problem with the teaching of English, and therefore, we should do something about it. So, you have this Wood's dispatch in 1854. So, this is the second phase. No, this is a person called Charles Wood was given this responsibility of talking about how the education system is operating, and he writes this entire dispatch. From 1854, Wood's dispatch, and to 1870, I have taken 1870 as the marker, because in 1870 some important bills are passed. We do not need to go into the details, but one of the bills that is, for example, passed is what is known as the Ilbert Bill. So, if you are aware of the Ilbert Bill allows Indian judges to judge Europeans, which is almost revolutionary. Yeah. So, it is Wood, oh sorry, I will write the name also, Wood's dispatch. This is 1854. So, what Ilbert Bill does is it allows Indian judges to sit as the head of the court, okay, and also try European offenders, which was unheard of. Only the white Europeans were supposed to judge. So, you have a revolutionary change over there. So, this is formulated, it is passed later, Ilbert's Bill, but this is the time it is formulated. But in 1870 also there are these new press acts that are passed. So, certain kinds of things can be published, certain kind of things cannot be published, etc. So, there are these press acts, yeah, so that are passed during this period. And because of this, remember, in between something important happens. something significant happens. This period,
Okay, the first war of independence.
we have 1857. Okay, so in 1857, which is in British history is called the Sepoy Mutiny, the rebellion in some histories, the first war of independence in some other histories, etc. So in 1857, the country, northern part of the country, not so much the southern part, goes up in flames. So there are these extreme, almost a warlike situation, at least in the northern part of the country. And because of this, there is a constant fear that if you keep on teaching English to these people in a certain way, you have to be very, very careful, because some of these ideas seem to have come from reading English authors. Yeah? So there is a huge amount of centralization that happens. This is when the textbook board are formed at that time. So these are Committee for Public Instructions, etc. They are formed at this point of time. Yeah? 1871 to 1882, people realized you can't centralize everything, so they start decentralizing. 1882 I have taken as the date because 1882 another important report is published, the Hunter Commission report. So the Hunter Commission report, which again is a report on education along with other things, and his name is W. Hunter, William Hunter. So Hunter says that, remember this is almost 50 years after Macaulay, he repeats what Charles Wood says. The teaching of English in the subcontinent has been a grand failure because people are learning their own languages. In fact, what has happened is there is a growth. Remember, this is the period when huge amounts of what we call regional languages today start making a massive amount of growth, including standardization. So Hindi is getting standardized, Bengali is getting standardized, Gujarati is getting standardized. So all regional languages have made a massive comeback. Okay? And Hunter says English education doesn't seem to be working at all. Okay? In fact, he recommends that the only way that the government can push English education is through funding heavily schools, colleges, universities. The government is least interested in teaching of English. This is also the period when nationalism, or so the nationalist movement starts gaining strength. So they don't want you to learn English. So this entire myth that the British were very interested in teaching of English is a myth. They were not. Right from the beginning they were not. They didn't want you to learn English in a certain way. Okay? So this entire myth has been created that English was the prerogative of the British Empire, etc. We learnt English despite the British. Okay? So I think that should be kept in mind, and now we have a huge amount of research that has happened that shows that the English Governor Generals and the Committee for Public Instructions were constantly writing to the British Parliament saying that please stop funding for the teaching of English, etc. From 1880 to 1900, of course, we have the Hunter's legacy, and I have taken 1900 as a benchmark for the end of the century. And 1901 to 1919, you have Lord Curzon, who becomes the Governor General, and he basically hates Indians learning English. Okay? So he comes up with this known as Indian Universities Act, where the universities, whatever they teach, will have to be passed through the censorship board. Any text that has to be introduced, etc., will have to be studied by a committee, mostly Europeans, and only then can they be taught, etc. This is also the time when Sedition Act comes into effect. So there is this law of sedition. So anything that you say against the government will be used for sometimes very harsh punishments. Okay? In fact, one of the freedom fighters for everyone. Indians would know him. Bal Gangadhar Tilak is jailed under the Sedition Act, and it's interesting that he is jailed because of a textbook, because in one of the textbooks that is used in the state of Maharashtra near Bombay, in Thane actually, there is this story of Shivaji, and in that story of Shivaji, it seems to the British government that Shivaji, instead of fighting against the Mughals, is actually fighting against the British. The story is written in such a way that you can interpret it both as Mughals and the British. Unfortunately, Tilak has been associated with that board. He is arrested, he is tried under the Sedition Act, etc. So, there is a whole story behind it. Yeah. So, let us see what kind of textbooks were getting used without getting too much into the historical details of that period, and you will be surprised. Okay. They look nothing like, yes, go ahead. Oh yes, every phase has textbooks. Every phase, right from here. So, textbook production begins here and it continues. I am stopping at 1919, even after that it continues. 1919 is an important date because, again, people who know Indian history, this is the date of Jallianwala Bagh. So, there is a change after that. Yeah. So, there is this massacre of people who are not aware of that history. There is this massacre in Punjab of peaceful protesters by the British Fusiliers. They were a special branch of the British armed forces. So, they trap these protesters inside a walled compound and shoot them down. Yeah, so, that is in fact, it is also historically important because I think you are reading Tagore in world literatures. Yeah, so, Tagore actually returns knighthood that has been offered to him because of Jallianwala Bagh, etc. Anyway, so let us look at the textbooks. So, to answer your question, it begins here, it is not here. So, we have a long history of creation of textbooks, and you will be surprised to see that what we consider as textbook today is not what used to happen earlier. Okay. This is phase 1 textbooks. I would like you to have a look. Can you read them? Okay. So, you have illustrations of the grammatical parts of the Gujarati, Maratha and English languages. This is produced by someone called Drummond. What do you think this is? So, the textbook is called Illustrations of the Grammatical Parts of the Gujarati, Maratha and English. So, Gujarati, Marathi and English. What do you think? What kind of a textbook is this? That is what we will assume, right? It is not. It has grammar, it has vocabulary, it has stories in all the 3 languages. So, you have the story first in Gujarati, your stories in the Marathi, and then your story, the same story translated into English. You have folk tales. So, this is what the book, I do not know whether I have no, I do not think I have got it, but if you want I can show it to you later. I might have a soft copy on my computer. And it is based on functional. For example, the first story that you read is on introduction. How do you introduce yourself in Gujarati? How do you introduce yourself in Marathi and then in English? The second story is about a conversation in the street. Okay. So, if you are gone to a shop, for example, how do you negotiate in Gujarati? So, this is, remember, 1808 this textbook is produced. And they are already thinking in terms of what we call functional English today. They are already thinking of communicative functions, because that is what is required in the colonial situation. So, if you are going to learn English, you are not going to talk to an officer. what you're going to talk to is probably low level officials where you need the basic smattering of English. Okay. The second thing that you notice over here is a translation of Murray's grammar, and these kind of translations happen quite a lot. Murray was a very popular grammarian of that period. So, you have a translation of Murray's grammar, and this is how the text looks. So, as you can see, what is given over here is in Gujarati, then in Marathi, then you have examples of words and how they are used, and then you have, it's not come out very clearly, I will just read it out from here. So, and then you have words in English over here. So, this words, for example, is in. Okay. Another thing that you will notice is that this is printed, but these are handwritten, because there is no possibility of printing the Indian script. So, they have to handwrite it, okay, and they use it in the classroom. Okay. This is the first phase. The second phase, remember, is after Macaulay till Wood's dispatch. Okay. What starts happening now is you have the British in the country for a very long time, almost 40, 50, 60 years. So, you also have important people who are there in the British. So, one important, such important character is someone called David Hare, okay, who establishes a school in Calcutta called the Hare School. It's still there, and he becomes a major educational reformer in that region. Okay. Large number of people, of course, remember it's undivided Bengal at that point of time. So, a large number of people from Assam, from what we call Bangladesh today, from Tripura, many of these students come to Calcutta to study at Hare School. So, after Hare dies in 1838, so these kind of biographies become important textbooks. So, you have a biography of David Hare, which is then used as a textbook in the class, okay, to teach morals, but also to teach the language. So, the biographies are used in a certain way. But you also realize that you need some sort of sentence that you need to teach. So, you have these short English, as you can see, short sentences in English and Gujarati, again 2 languages. It is not simply English. So, they are used in Gujarat classrooms extensively, where you go and take the same sentence, the students learn that sentence, but they also learn how the sentence is to be used in Gujarati, etc. So, it is a bilingual method. It is not a monolingual English textbook that you see today. This is Pyari Chand Mitra. Pyari Chand Mitra is a very famous educationist and a writer who died very young actually. He studied under Hare, so it was a kind of a tribute to him. Okay, people from Bengal would know. So he is the first Alaler Ghare Dulal. So the first, considered to be the first novelist in Bengal. Yeah? It's a kind of a critique, a satirical novel on the current social condition. Yeah? So he is the one who writes his biography, and then it is used in the classroom, etc. But the point that I am trying to emphasize is that what we consider to be textbooks today was not how it began. Okay? They began with this bilingual, sometimes multilingual, I showed you 3 languages, forms of teaching. Also, there was monolingual textbooks, but not in English. They were in regional languages. So, these regional language textbooks would be taken to the English classroom, and students would be asked to translate minimally from Bangla to English or from Gujarati to English. I will show you especially specific kinds of classrooms which I am going to show. So, let us come to phase 3. Now, phase 3, again there is a huge amount of explosion of textbooks, we will not go into that. But remember, it is during this stage that you have a committee of public instruction. Remember I talked about the censorship. So every textbook now has to pass through the Committee of Public Instruction. There are 3 committees of public instruction, one in Bombay, Mumbai now, one in Calcutta, Kolkata now, and one in Madras, Chennai now. These are the 3 major presidencies, as they are called. Okay? And the Committee of Public Instruction sits over there, they decide on what textbooks to use, etc. But this is also the point of time when most of these textbooks start becoming only English and no other languages. So there is now a shift from using other languages to English. This is also the time when the Indian Civil Service is formed. Okay? And there is a lot of this bureaucratic influence on how textbooks should be used, etc. Again, let's not go into the, and remember centralized fund disbursements. So all funds are with the government. You have to toe the line if you are going to use the textbook, otherwise you are not going to get funds. Indians, let me tell you, didn't bother too much because there was a lot of local patronage. So the local Rajas and Zamindars would run schools without bothering about government funds, but that's another story for some other day. So phase 4 is this reluctant decentralization, but as you can see, translation starts playing a very important role during this. So this is from, let me see the date, I don't think you can read the date because it's in Gujarati. This is from 1883, okay? And this is a textbook which is the most popular textbook in Gujarat, used across all schools for teaching of English, okay? And as you can see, it's called Anglo-Gujarati Translation Series. Okay? And as you can see, if I can read it out in Gujarati and in English, I am sure that most of you won't understand Gujarati, but it's good to listen to the language a bit. So what it says over here, I can read it from here as well. So here it says Chokrama, Chokra is boys, and then immediately translate, well my boys. So it's a kind of an address. Then it will have Lagna Padwana Shivam Pase Aveche, the holidays, vacation are coming near. Now generally what you see in textbooks is that if it's bilingual, you will have something in English followed by something in Gujarati. This is not so. It's almost translated within the sentence itself. Okay? So you have something in English, something in Gujarati, something in Gujarati, something in English, etc. It goes on. And all the lessons are like this. So this lesson is called a dialogue. The second lesson, as you can see, is called a teacher and its pupils and dialogue. It says, and the entire book is like that. So this is taught in the English classrooms, keeping in mind that Gujarati, if you keep Gujarati in the textbook, it will help them and probably connect to the textbook better than simply having English. This is what I was talking about. This is a textbook that is used for teaching of English. For people who cannot read Bangla, it's called Nari Shiksha, women's education, and it is written, this is the first part. There are 7 parts to this, okay? This is from Bengal, and this is published by something called Bama Bodhini Sabha. Okay? Now, Bama Bodhini Sabha in Bengal is a Brahmo organization. If you know a history of Bengal a bit, one of the reform movements that happened in Bengal, to which Rabindranath Tagore belonged, is the Brahmo movement. Okay? So Tagore belongs to the Brahmo sect. The founders were Raja Ram Mohan Roy and others.
There is a house called Brahman Samaj.
It's there across Bengal. We have forgotten it. It's got very few members left now who practice Brahmo, this thing. But remember, it was a very, very powerful at that point of powerful sect at that point of time in Bengal, because they were also very rich. So Tagore's family, his grandfather was the owner of a shipyard, and they were the ones who first started talking about educating women. Okay? In fact, the first educated women that you get in Bengal are mostly from the Brahmo families, most of them. So I'm sure that you have heard of this famous filmmaker in Bengal called Satyajit Ray. Yeah. Well, not in Bengal. He's an international renowned filmmaker, but yeah. So Satyajit Ray's family was a Brahmo family. His great grandfather was a Brahmo. Okay? So many of these early intellectuals belonged to the Brahmo tradition, including women. So the first woman doctor of Bengal belongs to a Brahmo family, etc. Her name is Devjani Ganguly. Anyway, so this is published by the Brahmo Samaj. It's called Bama Bodhini. Bama is woman, and so knowledge of women. So the sabha that gives knowledge to women. And these texts are now used in the classroom for the teaching of English. So women read these texts, then there will be some support given to them on how to translate these texts, and then they will translate them into English. So translation becomes an important, bilingual translation becomes an important method. Okay? And these texts are very interesting, and these are available on Internet Archive, so you could go and have a look at them. So they have all sorts of things. So they have small essays on science, because science becomes an important aspect during this period. Okay? For example, there is a lesson on how does rain happen, okay? And the lesson will explain how water vapor ascends and it forms the clouds, and the clouds then convert into rains, etc., etc. It will have women's biographies, famous women, mostly in the Western world, but written in Bengali, in Bangla. It will have poems, it will have stories, it will have fables and legends, parts of Ramayana and Mahabharata, etc., etc. So different sorts of texts are put together. Okay? No examination. There is no examination. If you are successfully able to translate these texts, you are promoted. That's it. Yeah? Phases 5 and 6. As I mentioned, Tilak is the one who is arrested as a seditious citizen. So you have this concern about the seditious citizen, and therefore you have to form the perfect British citizen in the country, and therefore textbooks start getting very, very regulated at this point of time. Also remember, this is the time, all of you know about this publishing company called Macmillan? Yeah? This is the time when they came into existence. So Macmillan as a publisher suddenly realizes, it was a very small publisher in London, they suddenly realized that textbook is a major business, especially in colonial countries. So they enter the textbook business. Okay? And they almost monopolize the production of textbooks in most of these colonies. Okay? And they produce the standard textbooks, which is then passed by the Committee of Public Instruction, and then everyone is supposed to read that textbook. So the standardization of textbooks, you might still have some people are still trying to keep the bilingual method alive, but this time onwards, the direct method becomes the norm. There will be no other language in the classroom other than English, and that is what we are still following even today. So remember, this is a colonial legacy that we have. It is not really something that we practiced for a very long time. We used all sorts of languages in the classroom for the teaching and learning of English. So one of the textbooks that Macmillan produced is actually a textbook called The Citizen of India, which became compulsory reading in all government schools and colleges. The textbook has, I think, 10, 11 chapters. It's again available on Internet Archive. You could go through it. And it tells you how to be an ideal citizen of the British Empire. Okay? Written by a colonel, actually, etc. So it's a textbook on the ideal citizenship, etc. And it becomes compulsory. Everyone has to read it. It's actually used in social sciences, social science textbook, but even all students in the class will have to read this textbook. So you see that there is this stronger impulse, especially after 1857, to control education in a certain way. So, one of the things that we can ask is that when we talk about textbooks or the nature of textbooks, we kind of assume that, well, English textbook will only have English. But if we go back in history, it doesn't, it shows us different pathways that we can take. And will it be possible to go back to those pathways? What were the advantages of those pathways? And probably study them. Yeah. So, remember, there were all these non-standard, local, community-based, region-based, local pedagogical practices. Okay. So, things that were taught in a toll or in a madrasa were not what were taught in a government public school. And these persisted for a very long time, till about 1947. I can give examples from India. Till 1947, many of these alternative methods of teaching. Oh, toll, okay, sorry. Toll is what is sometimes called a Gurukul. Okay. So, these were, I hate using that word, traditional schools, because this idea of tradition is extremely problematic, because remember, it was put up as a binary. So, you have the traditional or the modern. So, modern is the more progressive one, traditional is the more regressive one, etc. So, all this was created. So, it is a problematic term, but in want of a better word. So, these were older methods of teaching, which were kind of slowly getting replaced by what we call the modern method of teaching. Okay. And all these, and they continue, it is not that they disappeared. So, even today, for example, after 47, of course, they were kind of very rigorously suppressed. There was no funding available, there is no patronage available, so that they started disappearing. So, there were other methods of teaching which we have not explored at all. We kind of assume that any textbook should be only this, that it should follow these kind of patterns. So, to kind of provide that contrast, so I started with what we understand by textbooks today. So, this contrast is important for us to understand that textbooks were not the same. So, there is no something called the standard universal homogeneous textbook. There were different pathways that textbooks took. The third point, for example, there were multiple directions that we took, and therefore, one thing that, again, this is a research suggestion, something that not again the fourth semester, but the second semester can start thinking about, is if you can start thinking in terms of regional histories and sub-histories of textbooks. Okay. So, how, for example, was textbooks taught what is known as microhistory in your town, in your village, in your district? How were they taught? It is difficult work, remember, because many of these things might have disappeared. You will have to visit archives, you will have to visit libraries, you will have to find out, some of them will be available on Internet Archive, but not everything. You will have to talk to people who have knowledge of those kind of systems that were available, but I think it would be enriching to understand that history in a certain way. So, these micro histories are important because we have lost them in the process of creating these macro histories, which are always problematic. Okay. So, in the present light, so what are these text histories? So, when we talk about simply textbooks today, we forget that all textbooks had a certain kind of history lying behind it. Okay. And probably it is important for us to kind of go back to it and see what was really happening. Okay. In fact, I was talking to, I think, somebody, and he pointed out that when he went to this traditional school, the first thing he was asked to do was memorize the text, which we kind of shun out of the classroom nowadays. We say, oh, memory is not good. Okay, you should understand and then do things. So, what were the things of these methodologies that produce different sorts of textbooks? Okay. In fact, the British were constantly beating their heads, I did not mention that, when they used to go to these provinces, and then they realized that many of these people were using absolutely different methods and using the textbooks in completely different ways. Okay. In fact, there is a whole conversation, huge amount of this thing. So, in Punjab, for example, there is this, forgotten he is a colonel in the army, Williamson or Richardson or something his name is. So he goes over there, he is appointed over there to teach, well, to make sure that the teaching of English happens according to the British norms. Okay? He is absolutely unconvinced with this logic and takes up, he says the first, it's much more important to teach the vernacular languages. So instead of teaching, he goes around schools and tells them that you teach Gurmukhi and Punjabi first. English will come later. The British come to know about it and he's thrown out of the province. Of course, he's transferred. The local people write a petition with 70,000 signatures to the British Governor General that this man should be brought back to this province. And the British they have to relent. They have to bring him back so that this kind of education happens. Okay. In Bombay Presidency, we have umpteen number of examples that Elphinstone goes over there, Mount Elphinstone. He goes over there and he is convinced that first you should have mother tongue education and then you can slowly move on to English. He is of course overruled. So English is introduced, but what he does is he says we'll have bilingual textbooks. So all textbooks are produced in Marathi and in English and not only in English. So we have huge amounts of examples where there are rebellions within the British education system itself. Okay? And sometimes we forget that this is not a very straightforward path, and I think it's important to go back to those paths and re-examine them and try to understand our present context within those larger micro histories that are happening. So I promised you 3 stories, so I'll tell you those 3 stories because there was this interesting question coming from some of the students that we come from very extremely low resource classrooms. So when I was talking about technology, he said technology doesn't work over here, there is no internet, there is nothing, students do not have access to this. So instead of telling you, I am the worst advisor in terms of telling you there is no ready-made solution for something. What I can give you is examples of where low resource classrooms have not been a hindrance in the teaching of English. The first example comes from people from Bangladesh who would know this. Was an experiment that happened in Bangladesh from 2008 to 2018. Okay. This experiment is called English in Action, and it was a collaboration between Open University UK, the Cambridge University, the local Bangladesh textbook board, and BBC Janala. Okay. So there is this channel, Bengali channel called of BBC in Bangladesh, the BBC Janala. There are lots of YouTube videos on this. I will not go into the details, but I will just tell you what did they do. Now, one of the issues that many of the English teachers in Bangladesh were facing, especially in the rural and extreme rural areas, is accessibility to even textbooks. That is true of many of the Indian situation also. Okay. So the government might have sent them textbooks, but there are very funny stories. People sometimes would receive them, they would use it as firewood at times. I am telling you stories from India. Or sometimes they would simply sell them as, what is raddi in English, I do not know. Trash. So they will sell them as trash on weight because they will get some money out of it, because these are free textbooks, remember, so you can make some money out of it, etc. So we have very funny stories. So in Bangladesh, I am not very sure whether these stories apply to Bangladesh, but there were schools where there would be a single teacher teaching English and all the other subjects, and wouldn't have any training for teaching of English, wouldn't have any access to material, wouldn't have any access to resources. So some of these universities, they got together and they decided to do it in 4 steps. They said giving and sending materials to the printed material would be too expensive. So what they would do is, this is again, it's a very common method in language teaching. It's called a cascade model. I'll just write it. So, if you have seen a waterfall, it cascades down because there are different levels. So, this is called a cascade model. What is the cascade model? The idea is not to train everyone. It's impossible. There may be 50,000 teachers. How will you train 50,000? Instead of doing that, what you do is you train 1,000. These 1,000 then go out into different areas, districts or different places, and they would start teaching, let's say 1,000 each. Those 1,000 would go out and then teach another 1,000, etc. So, this is called a cascade model. So, the English in Action project produced a cascade model where certain numbers of teachers would actually be called to Dhaka, the capital, where they would be trained. Okay. They refused to use, because the philosophy of this English in Action was that we will, of course, we will give our expertise for teaching, but no one from either the white European UK or so called experts would be recording any videos. So, these teachers, once they were trained, they would record videos, okay, for example, of teaching a text or teaching a lesson. So, mostly during the vacations they would do it. For example, so the master trainers would come, they are called the master trainers. So, the master trainers would come during the vacation, they would be trained for a month, 2008 to 2018. So, this is the period of English in Action. In 2018 it is completed, now they have stopped. So, what they would do is they would record their videos. Some of these videos will be transmitted, telecast through BBC Janal, because TV was more or less available. In some rural areas, even TV was not available. Okay. So, what the project did was they would provide TV to the local panchayat, the local governing body, yeah, and the TV will be kept in the head of that local body, and a time will be fixed on Saturday, let us say, where people will come, and on Saturday this program will be telecast. So, all the teachers and even the villagers who are living in that area would come and see that program. But remember, no technology, no internet. So, you cannot transmit things through the net. So, what they did was they simply used a pen drive. Okay. They would load, let us say, every week 5 videos onto the pen drive, and then they would send it to the remotest of areas. Many of these master trainers would carry these pen drives. Okay. Remember, no laptops, no computers. So, only the master trainer would have laptops and computers. Okay. Or mostly computers at that point of time, no laptops even. So, what they would do is they would show the local teachers through that small desktop or laptop what was there in the videos. Okay. The videos were always accompanied by PowerPoints or some written material. They would also carry printed matter and give it to the teachers, and those were the material that the teachers would use in the classroom for the teaching of English. Okay. So, this is how the cascade worked. It went on for 10 years, and there have been quite a lot of studies of English in the project was called English in Action, EIA, and it showed remarkable improvement in the learning of English across many sectors of Bangladesh. There were failures, of course, but there has been remarkable improvements in many of the areas. In fact, one of the areas that they pointed out during this period was women's education. So, many of the girls would not go and get educated, they would stay at home. Okay. But because this looked interesting, teachers were doing new things in the classroom rather than following the traditional method, they would go to the class, attend classes, etc. So, one example of a low resource classroom, how it was used, one story. Okay. The second story that I am going to tell you. Remember, this hardly had any textbooks. This was mostly materials that were produced, sometimes used outside the classroom hours. So, students will be asked to come during Sundays, for example, and do, many of them were game based, fun activities based. They will do these activities and games and then go back. The second story is from India, and this is called a multi-Leela project, which is still going on. So, this thing stands for multilingualism and multiliteracies. Okay, so multi-Leela. This again has been sponsored by Open University. For some part of time, British Council was a part of this. What does it do? It has 3 centers. I mean, this was the pilot project. I think they are still continuing with it. One in Delhi, one very near. So, if you want to know about Multi-Leela, you can actually take a bus. One in Patna, okay, and one in Hyderabad. So, these were the 3 centers where the Multi-Leela project happened. What happened in the Multi-Leela project were they produced textbooks not only in English, but they would actually survey every area nearby. Okay. For example, around Patna, if there are 3 other languages that are available, let us say Bhojpuri, Maghai and any other language, Mathli, let us say. Okay. So, these are the speakers of, remember, many of them would not have a script. Okay. So, these languages will be taken into account, transcribed in the script that the students know, for example, Devanagari or the Hindi script, and then lessons will be built on them. Okay. So, using local languages for teaching of English, and they produced a series of textbooks. One of them I have just put up over there. So, they produced a series of textbooks using all the 3 languages, something that should remind you of how we began teaching of English, 3 languages at the same time, okay, with a lot of activities, etc. And these local students would use those languages for learning of English. Okay. So, those languages were not thrown out of the classroom. This is one thing. Again, there is quite a lot of research now available. Since one of my friends was involved with this, she has quite a lot of articles. Her name is Leena Mukhopadhyay. So, you could just search for her, and she has quite a lot of interesting insights into this. Sorry. But I am sure if you just search for Multi-Leela project, you will get all the, again, something that you can read upon, again for a low resource classroom. Okay. These are not classrooms equipped with computers and recording facilities and all that. Okay. These are very, very basic classrooms where they thought that bringing not only the standard Hindi, but also other languages which the students use at home, languages that are not standardized Hindi at all, can help students to learn the language better. Okay. The third story that I thought I will tell you before I stop today is something from the state of Odisha. Now, of course, this is spelled a bit differently. It is ODISHA, Odisha. And this project is called Multilingual Education. It is called MLE project. Now, this is even more ambitious. This project is meant for tribal children. Okay. Now, remember, tribal children do not have a script. Most of the tribal languages that are 17 in Odisha do not have a script. So, what they have done is they have gone to these tribal districts, collected, actually recorded the language that they have, transcribed them into standard Odia or any other nearest script that the students know, and then use this language for the first 5 years of teaching. That is it. no English, nothing. From 5 to 8, they introduced the standard language that is used in the state, that is Odia. So, the initial education is all in tribal languages, including activities, etc., etc. In standard 5 to standard 8, they introduced the local, the regional language. Along with the regional language, they also introduce English. They also have very interesting textbooks. In fact, we were having a conversation about whether we can create a textbook. Yes, you can. So, some of these examples, they have textbooks that would give you a good insight in how to create multilingual textbooks, not necessarily all in English, but also using the other language as a resource. For example, Bhasha Indonesia, you can use it as a resource to teaching of English. Okay. With very interesting activities, games, etc., etc. This project is still on. I am not very sure whether it has been paused right now, but it was on till last year. And there is again quite a lot of literature available on this. So, this project has been quite successful, because remember, tribal languages are the most neglected one, okay. Primarily because there is no scripting, and what gets taught in the classroom is mostly the standard regional language, okay, which is not the case over here, where you bring the tribal languages into the classroom in a big way. Okay. So, with these 3 stories, I think I will stop, but if there are any questions, you are more than welcome. I mean, my only, I finished a bit early today. My only this thing is, it would be interesting to look at these possibilities. Okay? Even if you are not a person who is going to do English language education or anything, okay? But the larger concerns about, because remember, language and culture are kind of inextricably linked, so you really can't separate them. Some of the projects that you can take up, maybe next year or whatever, could deal with an aspect of it. So, you can take up a larger macro project, but this could become a minor aspect of it. Yeah. Any questions?
When we say English language teaching, there is one thing to teach someone who is going to be in the workforce, let's say, which most of the time we are talking about. There are young kids already, let's say, but what about people who have crossed, let's say, 50? Now, for example, where I come from, let's say I'm from my place, my town, very small town. Now, there I want to teach people who are above 50, let's say, English. So, how do we do it? Because then it's a whole different matter.
So, ELT is the general terminology that is used for English language teaching, but there are also other terminologies. Remember, if I give you an example from Kerala, the southernmost state of this country. Kerala sends most number of nurses to international countries worldwide. So, Kerala women are renowned for their nursing abilities, and they have the maximum number of nurses outside the country, be it in the Gulf or the UK or the US or Canada or Australia, New Zealand. All these Kerala nurses are there everywhere, all across the world, African countries, etc. Now, one of the things that many of them, remember, nursing is an important profession, right? So, and you cannot make a mistake over there. You make a mistake in daily things, it does not matter. But if a doctor instructs you to do something and do something else, it might lead to serious consequences. Yeah? So, you have to be very careful with the English part of it, especially if you are working in an English speaking country. So, Kerala, in any nursing course, they have something called English for specific purposes. These are all meant for adults, yeah? Mostly 23, 24, 25-year-old women. And English in specific purposes can also be subdivided. Okay? So you can have something like English for occupational purposes. So if you want to become an engineer in an English speaking country, if you want to become a plumber in an English speaking country, your occupational needs are very different from whether you're going to become a teacher in an English speaking country. Okay? And therefore, you can always customize the kind of teaching that you're doing based on the needs. So what happens when you design these courses, you need a bit of a specialization to design these courses. So if 10 of you come to me and say that we are doing an engineering course and we would like to go to Canada and we would like to learn English for that purpose. Okay. So what I do, this is a part of research, but since you asked this question, it's good to talk about it. So there is a process called needs analysis. So I need to find out what your needs really are. Okay. So what do you need it for? Okay. How much of conversation that are you going to have with people in other professions, etc. So I do a needs analysis. Then I give you a diagnostic test. Okay. A diagnostic test tells me which parts of your language, if you know a bit of English, if you are going for engineering, I am assuming that you will know some amounts of English. So a diagnostic test will tell me what are the strengths that you have and what are the weaknesses that you have. Okay. And then I will design the course depending on both of this. So what are your needs and what are the things that you need to learn. I will also match it with what is known as a requirement analysis. So if you are going to Canada, what do they require from an engineer? So this process in research is called triangulation. I am sure that all of you know what triangulation is. So any kind of a research has to be triangulated. Okay? So there has to be a certain kind of a triangulation of research. So this is called triangulation. They don't know or they are not aware of it. They don't do much social science research. No, okay. All of you are doing just literary research, only literary research. Not a very important concept in literary research, but an important concept in social science research. Because you are dealing with human beings, you can just start with one question, because human beings have multiple facets and all those facets will have to be looked at. So you have to look at the same problem from 3 different points of view. That's called a triangulation. Okay. So you need to triangulate the problem. So if I am teaching, let's say in your own Basar area, 50-year-olds, I will do this. Why do they need English for? How much of English do they know? That's what the diagnostic will tell me. What do they require it for? Okay. And then I will design a course based on that. Yeah, so triangulation means you can have different kinds of triangulation, but basically it means that you approach the same problem from different perspectives.
Then there is a certain perspective, or it depends on the situation.
Depends on the context, of course. So for example, this was a teaching of English, but if I want to find out what kind of food that people in Pilki village eat, okay, and how does it relate to the social conditions that they live in. So this might be the thing that I am studying. Okay. So I can triangulate it, for example, in terms of I can do a demographic analysis. So what is the general population, age population of this? So demographic analysis is going to tell me what is the age group and what kind of foods are they likely to eat. The second thing I can do is what is known as an agrometric analysis. So what are the kind of things that are grown around over here? And the third thing that I can do is I can actually go and do an ethnographic survey of these houses and find out what kind of foods they actually eat. So all these 3 things will tell me the larger. So
Yes, sir. I will ask a few questions.
yes.
In
I think this one or so you have to pause the question a bit. Sometime later we'll just ask.
Have there ever been kind of experiment with English language and Indian script?
English language and you mean Romanization or you want the other Devanagari into English? We do it all the time. We do it all the time on WhatsApp, no? Sometimes, I don't know. I mean, some people, if they have something like Bangla on, they would type the English word in Bangla itself. They don't want to change to English. That is true, but I've seen examples of, especially when they use bilingual forms within the language, then you can have, you don't want to change to English to type that. So you type it in Bangla or Assamese or whatever language you are using on the pad. Yeah. But not very common, you're right. It's not a very common thing. ऐसे हैंड माइक अगर है तभी चलेगा. हैंड माइक है कोई?
यहाँ पे हैंड कॉलर माइक
माइक हाँ, पर मैं जवाब दूंगा तो फिर बदलना पड़ेगा वो, क्योंकि सवाल पूछ रहे हैं वो.
नहीं सर, तो यहाँ पे एक्स्ट्रा तो नहीं है, फिर यहाँ से करना होगा.
तो वहाँ पे तो उसमें नहीं है. क्या दें? उसको थोड़ा इधर हटा दीजिए, मैं इधर आया.
इसको अभी रिकॉर्डिंग ऑफ किए हैं क्या?
नहीं नहीं नहीं.
अच्छा.
कॉलर माइक हम दे देते हैं. आप यू कम हियर. इसको थोड़ा कैमरा को आप इधर हटा दीजिए. कॉलर माइक से
Hello. Okay. Yes, sir. My question is, sir, in India education system, high school level or matriculation test, English subject test, who make the questions and who check, and what are the pass marks and the distinction marks? And this is my question, sir. Yes. Can
just
you?
one question, or do you have other questions also?
Yes, and also what levels is supposed to for high school students? Yes, for example A1 to C2. Yes, sir. That's my question, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. Interesting questions. You can go. So what we see at the secondary level and the higher secondary level, the first question is who sets the exams. Depends on, so we have something called boards over here. So you might have something called a state board where the state takes the exam. For example, the Bihar State Board takes the Bihar state exams. Okay. You might also have private boards. For example, there are two major ones in India. Now, of course, there is a third board that is also becoming popular in cities. So two private boards, one is called ICSC, Indian Certificate of Secondary Education, and one is called CBSE, the Central Board of Secondary Education. Okay. The other board that is becoming a bit popular nowadays is called the IB board. This is the International Baccalaureate. Okay. Which is an international, if you want to travel abroad, if you want a degree that is valid across many of the countries abroad, then you do an IB. Okay. Depending on which board you are studying in, for example, if you are studying in a state board, then the state government has a committee that sets the questions for secondary and higher secondary level. If you are studying in ICSE or CBSE board, then they have their own committees. The ICSE will have a different committee to set exams, and CBSE will have a different committee for setting exams. Also remember that the assessment system is a bit different across all the boards. So CBSE, for example, now ICSE also, has something called the CCE. It's called Continuous Comprehensive Evaluation. So many of these, so the final exams may be of 70 marks, while the rest of the 30 marks comes internally from the school that you are studying in. In the state board, that is not followed. Some of the state boards have started following now, but for example, the West Bengal State Board has a 100-mark examination, the final, the secondary and the higher secondary board. Yeah? They don't have anything that is added internally. So it depends where you are, which board you are following. The second thing is, the second question I really can't answer because I don't think they follow the CFR at all. So what you are asking about A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2, that requirement still has not been implemented, but there is an assumption that if you are getting, for example, in CBSE, ICSE or in state board, again depends. If in state board, if you get 70%, it is supposed to be very good. It's a distinction, okay? But CBSE results can be, I don't know whether I should say this. So you might end up getting 95% in CBSE. Okay. There was a record set, to give you an example, that in one of the colleges in Delhi, I won't name it, a student had got 98.5% in the higher secondary and could not get admission because the benchmark that was set was 99%. So I don't really know what that 98.5 or 99 means. So because there is no, especially for English, there is no benchmark that has been set. That at the end of standard 12, you should have a B2 level or a B1 level. At the end of your college, you should have a C1 level. At the end of your MA, you should have a C2 level. So those benchmarks have not been set. We do not really follow a CFR model in that sense. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, sir, one more thing. Actually,
yes, sir. One more thing is, actually you already answered most of the questions, but I want to go into more detail. For example, in our country, Myanmar, the high school level, the teachers are from the state, but the question is made by university professors. So there is, when we check, when their answer paper check, it is a mix of the state teacher and university teacher lecturer, and the head are professors from university, in charge I mean. So, and what about, I also want to know that situations, in India, yes, yes, thank you.
That's interesting actually, because in CBSE boards, there are something called subject advisors, okay? For every subject, there'll be an advisor, and they generally are from colleges, universities, etc. I'll give you another example from NCERT, National Council of Educational Research and Training, which used to be a central body for producing textbooks of different types, okay? Not only in English but also other subjects. The NCERT experts who produced textbooks were mostly university professors, university colleges. But when it came to setting of exams, it's mostly by the subject teachers. You might have a subject advisor. So it is done in 3 stages in many of these school boards. So these 3 stages are, let me just. these are the 3 stages. So, first one that they do is they create a pool. Okay. So, you have a pool of questions which many subject teachers send. For example, if I am an English teacher, they will say that you send us 100 questions. Similarly, they will ask, let us say 200 English teachers to send 100 questions each. So, they create a pool. Once that pool is created, the second stage is what is known as moderation. So, they send it to moderators to see which questions have which difficulty levels. Okay. So, they divided it into difficulty levels, and then it moves into a random selection. So, a particular year's question paper will have randomly selected simple to moderate to difficult questions and then form the question paper. That is how it is done. But it is not, definitely not the university professors who set the question paper. They might be there in the committee as subject advisors, but they do not set the question paper. So, that might be a bit different in Bhutan.